lunch.
That way you know where you're at. But Dr. Michael King, thank you so much for being here to
You're
talk to
welcome.
us
My
today.
pleasure.
Can you tell, just for the listeners and the viewers that maybe aren't familiar with you, what's your background, and what do you
Well,
do?
I have a strong background in physics and with a specialty in things like field displacement and electromagnetic fields. Um, I've also I've got a doctorate in physics. I've got a doctorate in psychology, um, and I don't find in the Society of Consulting Psychologists. Um, they asked me a question. I was featured as a mentor in the publication, and they asked me, "Is it difficult to make a transition from physics to psychology?" And my answer to that is no, because there are a lot of rules of physics that are sequentially obeyed that can be applied to human interaction as well. And I like to refer to things like Isaac Newton's ideas that once a body is in motion, it tends to stay in motion. And that's a true of human psychology as well, because people, quote unquote, cling to the familiar,
Hmm.
which means that if the familiar is their path and their motion, they stay there.
Well, I want to talk to you about this, the consciousness electromagnetic field theory. But before I get to that, um, can you tell me about, because I understand that you have some knowledge of out of body
Yes, I've
experiences.
experienced I've had two near-death experiences. First one was when I was about 16 years old. The second one was when I was about 52 years old. Um, the interesting thing about that is early in my life, um, I had, because it turns out there's an ancestral history that goes back to roughly 1525. Um, that has some, I'll call them abilities or attributes in my family. My mother had them, for example, and this is a family from a small nobility in Spain. Um, I'm a distant relative and about 26 generations later of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, who's got a fair amount of legend all to himself. And it's a long story. There are about 150 books written about him and a full length movie, which is all in Spanish. So if it, one thing I get a kick out about that movie is there will be a dialogue in Spanish that's paragraphs long, and then the subtitle converting it will be like one or two sentences long. It's kind of like it's a difficult translation anyway, or an incomplete translation. But basically, from a young child, like as a young child, about age 8 years old, more or less, I started demonstrating abilities because my mother and I, on a summer afternoon, would have. My mother had a deep intellectual ability. She had an intellect of about 205. She spoke several languages, four languages fluently. For a woman born in 1907, she all she ever did in her life was go to university. She had multiple degrees. You might have, for a woman born in that time frame, you can call her emancipated, but then she had a family that supported it. Anyway, the I, as a young child, I could see auras. I would sometimes have precognitive experiences. I remember one time on a Sunday, on a summer afternoon, I looked up in the sky and I saw an airplane. A wing fell off an airplane. And it looked like it was about the size of a D3, DC-3, except that it happened in a place, I was standing in our backyard. It happened in a place where I couldn't have possibly seen it. So there's been a lot of experiences like that, and including things like seeing aura around people, um, and a lot of what I'll call metaphysical experiences. that I just basically had to live with, because if one tries to deny that sort of thing, you don't have to publicize it or admit it to the world, but if if you try to suppress it, it's damaging yourself. And the good news was that my mother had those abilities as well, so she and I could discuss it together. And I remember one afternoon we were um, we were lying on the bed staring at the ceiling actually, and I would see striations of different colors basically floating around, and so would she. So we could have conversations about what we were seeing mutually. So my history is, in terms of what we might call the metaphysical, and to me, by the way, as a physicist, the metaphysical as a term is just the part of physics that isn't yet explored or thoroughly explored. So I don't make a particular distinction between known physics and metaphysics. Metaphysics just isn't explored. It's physics not yet explored. So that's kind of my view on it. So and I was raised as a Catholic, and my mother was, as a Spaniard, was very Catholic. My father, on the other hand, was from Texas. um, he he was a colonel in the Marine Corps, and he was on at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So I really didn't meet my father until I was about 5 years old, because he was off to war, and I was born about a month before Pearl Harbor happened. He wouldn't let his pregnant wife go to Pearl Harbor, so he had a premonition or a feeling that something was going wrong very quickly. And there's a long history to that I could babble about for quite a while, about documented history about Roosevelt and the Japanese and so forth. But I think of it as a constructed event just because of known history that's in the files of the State Department. So this is off your topic, though. You asked me.
Well, so when you had these experiences as a child, and I'm assuming you
Oh,
talked to
sure.
your mom about it. Um, did you talk to
Yeah,
anybody else?
because my mother and I would have these joint shared experiences that we could easily talk about. There was one experience that scared her. She had some friends, and this is all in my book, by the way. She had some friends, and this is probably because of her station in life, although I don't really know. She tended to gravitate toward people that were in musical arts. She was a concert pianist at one time. Um, and she started teaching me piano when I was, I think, 4 years old or thereabouts. Anyway, she had some friends who were uh, of nobility. One particular woman was a baroness, and she had, I don't remember, her name was Dvorak, though. Um, the Baroness de Dvorak. Um, anyway, she was from wealth, or had wealth. Her husband, who looked a lot like Albert Einstein, hair and so on, was a surgeon, a licensed surgeon in the United States, and he came from Europe at the right time, meaning they avoided the Nazi purge and so on. And I remember they showed up at the house um, to say goodbye. And they were more or less regular social visitors to my mother. And when I was about 10 years old, they showed up to say goodbye because they were planning on going on an ocean cruise. And they were going to break their pattern and be gone for about a month. Well, something came over me as she approached me. Interestingly enough, she looked a lot like, she had the stature of a Marlene Dietrich kind of person, kind of look, and an attitude to match, I might add. Anyway, they came over to the house, and we were having a social gathering, and they dropped this uh, fact of their trip. And basically, what happened to me is I went ballistic. I had a premonition that was so intense it completely overwhelmed me. I dropped to the floor and I grabbed her ankles. And I was screaming, "Don't go, don't go, don't go." And basically, if anybody saw this, it would be a 10-year-old child throwing a fit. That would be the image they would see. Because it was so overcoming to me. And um, my mother tried to get me off. Nothing worked to stop what was happening. Finally, after some period of time like this, um, she she usually had gloved hands on, and she bent down and stroked my face because I was still grabbing her legs. And she said to my mother, anything that had that impact of emotional impact on me, she was going to pay attention to. So she canceled her trip. She said she would cancel her trip. And that just brought this immense relief to me. And at that time, I was um, still I was wobbly at the time. I mean, it was hard for me to stand up and walk because I had been so overcome with emotion for however a period of time this went on. Anyway, they canceled their trip, and about a month later, it was announced that the ship they were going to go on sank. So that scared my mother, even though she and I had this kind of shared um, history together. Um, that scared her to the point where she was worried as a Catholic that I was somehow possessed because of the intensity of it. Well, the it just overwhelmed me. I wasn't particularly scared. I was just exhausted. Anyway, so she decided to. She was very involved in the Catholic Church in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and through the Chancery office, where she was very well connected, because I went K through 12 in one private Catholic school. Um, through that, pardon me. Anyway, through that experience, she made arrangements to haul me to the Archbishop's mansion of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles because she had heard there was a priest there from Spain who was considered to be an exorcist. So she hauled me down there, and I was impressed by how plush the mansion was and all that sort of thing for a young child. Um, and there's a long story to this in any detail, but the story was I was hauled in to meet this priest. I immediately saw his aura. His aura looked a lot like my mother's. Um, uh, and I had this private session with him, closed door session. And basically, he said, I'm okay. He had similar abilities that I had or have. And my mother just needed the reassurance. And after I'm going to guess maybe an hour I was with him, we had this exchange, which was often telepathic. We didn't have to have words. The intensity was so strong. So when it was all over, he came out and greeted my mother, holding her hands, and she had tears and all that sort of thing. But she said that there's nothing wrong with me. It's just the way I am. So perception is perception. Right? So that's kind of the intense story that my mother needed reassurance. Now, on the way home, driving home, because she was emotional to the point where she was a little wobbly driving the car. Um, on the way home, it was then that she admitted we had a family history of this. That's very well done.
Family history of family history of what? What did she say you had a history
Precognitive,
of?
spiritual, um, perceptive abilities most that are documented back to about 1500, 1525. And be, anyway, anybody that wants to look that up can do a search for the miracles of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, because that's my mother's maiden name.
So, after that experience, um, when did you get involved in physics, and how long were you? Are you still a practicing
No.
Catholic?
Um, I, I,
Okay.
I had a different version of spirituality that occurred to me. Religions in general want to sell religions. And I did some history. I learned how the New Testament was written, which was generally speaking all orchestrated by Constantine. And Constantine had the problem that Christianity, this was about 300 AD, by the way, about 300 years after Christ died. But he had the problem that the public, uh, the citizens of Rome, were generally gravitating more and more toward what we now would call Christianity. Um, the original Bible stories started from about 40 AD to about 180 AD. And they were unknown authors. Nobody. There were stories that were around the Mediterranean, and nobody really knew who the authors were at the time. Well, Constantine had a political problem. The Roman military followed an ancient Persian sun god by the name of Mithras. Um, the That was kind of the base structure of the way the military was organized. Um, the Catholic Church, by the way, is organized very much like the sect of Mithras was organized, historically documented. Anyway, so he needed, because there was no central reference for what became Catholicism, he decided to put together a Council of Nicaea, that started around 310 or 315 AD, to gather these stories from around the Mediterranean that talked about Christ. And they were, remember, this is three centuries later, so they were very fragmented stories. But the idea was he had about, I, if my memory serves me correctly, he had about 34 of what we would now call Gospels that they compiled in this council. And some of them were at odds with each other. For example, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, they didn't allow, because it was Pope Gregory much later that declared Magdalene was a prostitute. And that was absolutely a lie. She wasn't. She might have even been the bride of Christ. No, we don't really know. But she is referenced in the New Testament works as much more frequently than any of the apostles. So she was a very prominent figure. Anyway, so what happened was Constantine gathered those parts of the Gospels that agreed with each other, and those that didn't agree, like Magdalene's, for example, they were thrown out, banned from the Bible, so to speak. And Magdalene said that one's evolution is up to self. It's not up to religion. It's not up to God. It's not up to Christ. It's your own development going through the different layers within your own self-consciousness. That's essentially what she said. Well, the church can't allow that, right? So, but Constantine and his council decided to try to use the Bible to unify the difference between the sect of Mithras and the citizens of Rome, even to the extent that what was then known as Mithras' birthday, December 25th, they assigned to be Christ's birthday. And there was no documented evidence for that either. So there's a long history of the way these points work historically in religion, and I think humanity that is desperate to have reference systems. So if there's something humans don't know or understand, they assign a god or mysticism to it, like volcano gods or rain gods or sun gods or whatever. So, in my view, man creates God to satisfy their own insecurity about knowing something like that. It's a long story. There's a lot of documentation on this that could be a doctoral dissertation all by itself.
It sounds what you're describing from uh, Mary Magdalene, like what you have kind of wrote about. So I was wondering if that influenced you, and then what made you decide to write your book, Your book, by the way, is called "Atheists Can Get to Heaven,"
Yes.
right?
Something, by the way, that
Yeah. So
something,
talk
by the
about
way,
that.
that the recent Pope acknowledges. He actually put out a notice to that effect.
What now?
The
Say that again.
recent Pope, the current Pope, about, I have to think about this, around 2009, I think, or 2010, in that general envelope, the recent Pope actually admitted that atheists can't get to heaven. And I'm essentially quoting what he said. That was after my book was published.
Oh, that was after your
Yeah.
book was published. Well, what motivated you to write the book?
Well, I thought that I the original title for the book was Beyond the Tunnel of Light, because there are a lot of reports about near-death experiences that talk about people being in that. There's something I use as a term that I completely sign up to, and I call it state of being. People say, I'm going to go to heaven or whatever. Well, I don't say that. I say that life is a continuum, and we simply graduate from the physical to the metaphysical, the physical organic to the inorganic. Um, and that's part of the continuum. And therefore, heaven is not quote unquote a place, it is a state of being. And essentially, the reason why the original title of the book was Beyond the Tunnel of Light is because there are a lot of, like I said, there are a lot of stories around that many people have written. I have no idea how many, but many, um, where they've gone into the so called tunnel of light and met relatives or um, somebody who's just perished. I think one of your other interviewees had that experience, um, or knew or interviewed somebody that had that experience. So because I went beyond the tunnel of light, I went much further than the other books that I'm aware of. I emphasize that I'm aware of because there may be some that I'm not. And they go into the tunnel of light, and they're in this state of being, and they meet deceased relatives, or facetiously, I'll say Aunt Fluffy or something that embraces them. Um, but I went much further than that. And I did that. I decided to do that, quote unquote, by my will. I would add that about 1975, um, before the most recent near-death experience happened, which was about 1993, um, or 1994, because I was then 52 years old. I I had been trained. My life wasn't in a good shape. Um, uh, I was desperately depressed and so on. And so and my ex-wife, and part of my problem was problems with my ex-wife, but um, and I might add that we had a daughter who had just died of leukemia, so it wasn't a good time in my life. So anyway, she sought out a group of what I'll call holistic psychologists, and they recognized. It turned out they had similar abilities and perceptions that I had, and it turns out that they were able to work with me for about 3 years and refine and help me develop what might be called my own spirituality as an individual. And at the final stages of that, I got to the point where they could put me in a condition where I could project my consciousness out of my body, monitored my chief mentor at the time, who turned out to be an Episcopalian priest, by the way. Um, but anyway, I was able to experience out of body projection by a combination of my will and his support. And it was such a wonderful experience. And this was around 1976, I think. I may be off a year or two, a long time ago. But that was such an elating, wonderful experience of freedom that I was tempted not to come back to my body. And And then I had enough intelligence to know that a novice supported by a mentor does not an expert make. So I decided to return. But the 1994 experience of near death, zero pulse rate, zero. I bled to death basically. But that experience, I hemorrhaged um, because of severe attack of diverticulitis that I didn't know I had, but I bled to death through my colon. And it turned out that experience was very similar to the experience I had uh, 20 years before with my mentor, um, who has since passed on. But so there's a lot of history that built up to this, and it's kind of like if you lived it through the lens of my life, it's kind of like, gee, I've been prepared for this ever since about age 8 years old or so. For me, it's a continuum, even though it's been a very bumpy ride. It's a continuum, and it turns out that the way I have visions of things um, started a lot with my technical career. I started in my technical career at age 19, and the company that hired me, which was kind of an instantaneous hire, I didn't really apply. I was escorted in, so to speak. But in roughly around 1960, the Air Force was having a problem, and at the time I was what I'll call a grunt technician. The Air Force had a problem with the telemetry system in the Atlas ICBM missile. There was a long history to this. The Atlas missile was liquid hydrogen fueled, and liquid hydrogen is nasty stuff. I mean, it's very corrosive. It's obviously volatile. But the fuselage, the shell of an Atlas missile is kind of frail, and you can't. It's not physically possible to have one of these things lying down fueled and then elevate it to the launch position and then light it off. So you have to elevate it to the launch position first before it can be fueled. And at the time, what was kind of like the middle part of the Cold War, at the time it took 45 minutes to do this. So, and we only had at the time, by the way, 50 ICBMs and warheads. Nothing like the thousands and thousands, 10,000 that happened later. Some genius figured out that the flight from the Soviet Union over the Ural Mountains took 35 minutes. For us to go, we're being under attack, launch is 45 minutes. It means we're incinerated before we can counterattack. So there's a lot of history to that. And anyway, they were having a problem with the telemetry system. And I was just a grunt technician. They brought the system into the lab separately from the missile that had hired me. And remember, I'm 19 years old. I have no credentials, but I have visions. So I just happened to be standing around, and they were showing what was going on. And I noticed coincidence of something happening that happened at the more or less exact time that the telemetry system went haywire. And I put the two together, and I said, after about, I don't know, an hour or two of studying that, it was easy. I said, I see what's happening. I know what this is. And that kind of struck everybody because a grunt technician just doesn't know these things, I guess. So somebody from the Air Force said, you can't know that. This is top secret stuff. And I said, well, I do know it. I can't unknow it. I don't have a degree. You take care of the top secret problem because I have control over that. So that's how my whole career started, really. And then from that, the government decided that I should be kept kind of under a cocoon, and for obvious reasons, I said, well, I would kind of like to get an engineering degree. And they had a remote operation in Washington D.C. Surprisingly enough, And I got my bachelor's and master's through them, and then later on a doctorate through also another government lab that was working on high energy stuff like laser weapons and so forth. Anyway, long story. But yeah,
Okay. Are you still
no.
are you retired?
Um, I'm
No.
these days I don't have that kind of heavy demand. Obviously, I used to travel around the world at the rate of 400,000 miles a year um, on this system or that system. I've worked a lot in Europe and Taipei, and um, anyway, there's not a, as you I've taught at the University of Oxford and Cambridge in England. The short-term invited lectures kind of thing. Anyway, the well, as you teach a lot of people, uh, the demand for this sort of systems integration, compatibility sort of thing is ubiquitous. Everything electronic, all systems demand it. And I was only one of a handful of people that knew it in around 1972. I remember Hewlett Packard called me with a big problem. Uh, and I said, okay, I can phase out of, around that time. I said, I can phase out of this military stuff and get into commercial stuff just as a natural progression. And that helped my career. But the main point of this whole thing is that all of this just supported what I'll call evolution. It's not, I never ever really got an academic degree um, to sell myself with a degree. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until 2010 that I even admitted to anybody I had the credentials because I didn't care. It was just a learning experience for me. So, and
What? Well, let's first of all, I want to correct myself because I didn't give the full name here earlier, but the consciousness electromagnetic information
yes,
field theory. Um, can you talk a little bit about that? And just, I wanted you because it's a little bit complex, I think, for our listeners and our viewers that aren't familiar with it. So, do you mind giving us kind of a breakdown of
well,
that
it
theory?
occurred to me. I'll give my independent statement. Then I'll refer to that. It occurred to me somewhere a very long time ago that when I was working on my own form of spirituality, evolution as spirituality, it occurred to me, and this was probably during the time that I connected with those holistic psychologists I talked about around 1975-ish, more or less. Um, it occurred to me that there's been a lot of work done on the neurology of the brain, and I know a number of your guests have focused on that. And I thought, okay, well, we know that the brain, hard science, we know that the brain is a bioelectric instrument. It's basically a bioelectric computer, if you want to think. There's been a whole lot of speculation of what the capacity of the brain is. All of these, like for example, somebody said it's 100 gigabits of data equivalency. And to that I said, you don't have a clue what it is. Because electrodynamic systems like that, that are in a quantum state, don't have those kind of defined, um, defined numbers or limited numbers. They can expand, they can develop them in their own state. Well, it occurred to me though that, well, if the brain is bioelectric, then fields can influence the brain. And if we can show that fields influence the brain, then the brain can influence the fields. Well, gee, it turns out that that's exactly true. Back around 1969, we were experimenting. If you know something, now that you know something of my history, we were experimenting with quasi um, static fields, static meaning not varying, to see how people would react to fields. A team from Stanford University sent Stanford, SRI, Stanford Research Institute, sent Dr. Teddy Pierce and a group of students or interns to Bridal Veil Falls in Yosemite National Park. And it turns out that the field measured from the triboelectric charging, that is to say, the water molecules flowing, knock off electrons from the atmosphere, pretty much the way your shower curtain responds to your shower and the shower curtain being drawn into, that's electric fields from the shower that draw the shower curtain into the water stream or toward the water stream. So it turns out that there's about it's a negative polarity, but polarity is arbitrary. Sometime a long time ago, somebody said it's plus or minus, but it's a differential. It doesn't really have a plus or minus valuation per se. Anyway, the field intensity at the base of Bridal Veil is about 2,500 volts per meter. And if people walk up toward Bridal Veil and don't get wet, a lot of the reports are they psychologically feel elated, like a closer, my God, to these sort of feeling. So knowing that, we thought, okay, what if we set this up in a laboratory and see what experiences that we can experience, that we can report in a lab environment. And it turns out it's just like that. If you have enough field intensity and expose a human being to it, they will feel elated. And then, because we've been working on an EELF system for submarines to communicate all over the world, we realized, we've known for quite some time, that the planet Earth is a concentric cavity. That is to say, if you take a sphere and overlay a very large sphere with a smaller sphere, the distance in between the two become a transport layer for electromagnetic waves, and they become very uniform because it's a sphere and a sphere. Basically, I try to make this simple. I know I'm touching on some things that are going to be hard for a lot of people to understand, but I say, so what if you took a baseball and magically supported it in the middle of a basketball? Well, the basketball would become the ionosphere, the baseball would be the planet Earth. The distance between the baseball and the inner of the basketball is this cavity resonance I was talking about. And it turns out that there is a resonance structure, because if you light this thing up with energy, with field structures, it would be ubiquitous anywhere in the planet. And I thought, well, okay, if we take brainwaves and look at brainwaves and see what this cavity resonance really looks like. And it turns out that Schumann, back in the 50s, Otto Schumann, physicist from Germany, had found this resonance structure, and he found it was basically tuned to low brainwaves around 7 hertz. And I said, okay, well, if some hippie someplace say they are somehow tuning themselves to the planet, it's true. The physics of that supports that if you can focus your brainwaves to match the Schumann resonance, which is 7 point something hertz, don't remember the decimal places at the moment, then you would have telepathic communication to anybody else on the planet Earth. Now, we realized a long time ago, that radio amateurs, the ionosphere is a conductive sphere. And radio amateurs learned that because somebody that understood it could set their antenna to set a signal up to bounce off the ionosphere and connect to a radio amateur somewhere else on the planet, because otherwise radio frequencies tend to travel in a straight line, so they could get over the horizon that way. So this kind of all comes together. What they didn't know is that there really is a Schumann resonance. It's really well documented, and then it's logical that if somebody can tune to this and is sensitive enough with the telepath to be able to pick up the other side of communication, you can be anywhere on the planet and have empathic feelings or communication. And that doesn't necessarily have to be telepathic, but it can certainly be empathic. Anyway, so there's just a lot of this bits and pieces, that come together that way, that are hard science, really. It's just understanding how these things work. Now, one of the problems is it occurred to me that, well, okay, the brain is a bioelectric. That means it must have a field, because anything electric must have a field. Well, so first thing is, I thought, well, this is just my own private musings here. I haven't published anything about it. But it occurred to me, well, if you're lying flat on a bed and doing nothing physically, just lying flat out, how much energy and power does the body take to maintain itself? The answer to that is about 100 watts. If you're not physically exerting something, just sleeping or something like that. And they said, okay, how much does the brain take of that 100 watts? What percentage of that is the brain? Well, bioelectrically, you need to have blood circulation and all that. But the bioelectric part of the brain, if you include the blood circulation, about 25 watts. So about 25% of all the physical stuff is um, brain activity, or the support of brain activity, for example, blood circulation. Well, that's about what we use to get Voyagers launched out into space, or go to the moon. It's about a 20-watt transmitter link. Um, so I thought, well, all right, that's certainly enough power to light up this concentric sphere over sphere, um, supporting the idea of the way empathic connections can work. And those people that I mentor have those empathic connections with me, depending on, not necessarily in everyday life, just when something intense happens. Um, and then the other thing that happened was, okay, if the brain is bioelectrical, it must have a field. That means consciousness could be a field. Now, when I traveled, let me see, there's two parts of this. I'll try and stay on point. It occurred to me that the bioelectric activity of wavelength, if I just look at it as wavelength going off into space, then I use kind of the low-end brain waves of Schumann found 7 hertz, but I'll pick it up a little and say 10 hertz just because the math is easier. Um, the wavelength of 10 hertz is it's something over 18,000 miles. I mean, it's a big number. And I thought, well, okay, if I'm going to experience a near death, if I'm going to have a near death experience, or what I had with my mentors back in 19 whatever it was 76, 77, that's not 18,000 miles. I have a coherent presence that's, I'll call it a cocoon for lack of a better term. I'm intact as a cocoon. Well, when I traveled in near death, I maintained that cocoon. If I were to see your aura, which I'm not going to be able to do on television link, but if I were to see your aura, I would see a field around your body that is roughly 2 or 3x the physical size of your body. That's the electric field projection that you have. People who are very negative and people who are very dependent, that cocoon doesn't propagate beyond the body. They're sociologically would call them anal or something like that, or it's too big a risk to let self out, so to speak. So, and I think they would have a very bad time with near-death experience, because if they're very, very dependent, if they can't have an independent freedom of thought, they're not going to let themselves go. And the really evil people on the planet Earth, the Adolf Hitlers of the world, they're completely dependent on usurping the energy of others. So on a scale of 1 to 6, 0 to 6, where 6 is the power of Christ and 0 is the moment of death, they're zeros. They go nowhere. They don't have a life that continues after death. So if that leaves 1 to 5 afterward, and then the question is just how far have you evolved in life? So in my near-death experience in 1994, I had the opportunity, because I found mentors that religions would call angels. I call them the consortium of consciousness of the universe. But I met them, interacted with them, and they weren't my spiritual guides; they were my mentors. The way I mentor people effectively, I've had a great deal of experience doing that, and particularly with battered women. And that's, if I think of anything as my legacy on Earth, it's less the physics side and more the development of others. Where the idea is to help them find themselves as independent people without dependencies on the monsters that beat them, for example. Anyway, so it's a long, long story that all really works together. So the question is, how do I maintain myself coherently, either with my mentors when my consciousness projected beyond my body? I could actually see my body in a prone position. And when I returned to it, it was very inhospitable. It was freezing cold, and my pulse rate was something down to 30 beats per minute, or very inhospitable. Anyway, um, the and that was some similarity to my near-death experience, except that when I traveled out, I had the opportunity to just let my body die, and I didn't actually know if the experiences as I write in my book, I didn't actually know if I could return to my body. I didn't know if my body was viable to support life, because when I was in the ER, they asked me, "Can I stand up?" Because they had wheeled. I was bleeding to death. They had a trail of blood behind me. I didn't know if I had the strength to stand up. And they said, because they had me in a wheelchair, and I said, and I remember the quote, and the feeling, by the way, I remember the quote vividly. I said, "I've lost, I'm going to," and before I could say the word die, I was gone, dead. And then, I went through this magnificent adventure of several different events beyond the tunnel of light. I was in the tunnel of light that I think of as kind of a fog, and I said, "There's got to be more to this." So I sort of thrust myself against it, um, because when you know you're dying or dead, why not, right? Why not go to the limit? What else can you? What can you gain or what can you lose? Well, if you're going to die, you're going to die. Um, anyway, so I took this little adventure as my own. I took this challenge as my own adventure to go for several different experiences. And the first one was an image of kind of an Orthodox Greek priest that was challenging me, "Come with me, I will take you to God." And my first reaction was, "You're a fraud. Oh, nobody's going to take me to God. If I'm going to go to God, I'm going to go there by my own power and will, not because you can take me." So anyway, it's as I said, I hate to be redundant, but this is a very detailed story that runs through a life of 70 years now. So from my point of awareness, because I'm 82 years old now, um, it's the things that are consistent is, number one, be self, um, be coherent within self, and lose all dependencies to others and so on. And don't be manipulated. Be yourself. Those are the keys. And that's basically what Mary Magdalene said.
Okay, and then so for you, I want to ask you two questions on kind of the book topic. One more scientific, one more personal. Okay. Um, so so you have this experience, and you've had a lot of experiences. It sounds like in your lifetime, and like I talked to Bernard Heisch, for example. Um, his as an astrophysicist, his philosophy of consciousness is overlaid with the existence of God. Um, so it sounds like you don't really feel the same way in that area. And then I also wanted to ask you, in terms of this theory specifically, I know there's a few criticisms of it, but not too many. I think I saw maybe three main criticisms. Are there any that bother you that make you go, hmm? I don't know how I feel about
Well, if
that.
I put on my physicist hat, um, it's such a difficult. Kind of go back to the root cause. Like, we know there's a field. We know there's a field around anybody's body. It's a question of magnitude. It's not an if. It's a question of magnitude. Um, if we had the time, I could run some experiments with you right now, and from a perceptual point of view. But I think that's off the target for what your podcast is. Um, the and it would take a lot, by the way, to get you to focused in that specific, in a very narrow area. So maybe later privately if you want to experiment with it, but not now. Anyway, the the problem is if I just use um, standard electromagnetic field theory, and I work with the energy of the brain, which, like I said, is a matter of a few watts. Um, what holds that together as a coherent sphere? Standard electromagnetic wave theory doesn't allow that. It doesn't have that. I'll call it a cocoon. I've said that before. The cocoon is the coherence of self. What holds this together? Well, because standard electromagnetic wave theory has a propagation that goes into space forever to eternity, it doesn't. It does it as a linear progression of wave propagating away. What holds it in coherence? The only subject that we can come up with today is components of quantum mechanics and experiments in quantum mechanics at the subatomic level, electrons particularly. Like I told about using fields to um, stimulate emotions in people. Well, using the Schumann thing, where we know brain waves match to this concentric sphere waveguide, we decided to screw around with this because we were working on the idea of communications in submarines. Well, you can interfere with the brain by fields. It's basically like, if you have a radio station and you want to jam the radio station, you can do that with the brain. If we modulate the fields, uh, not quiescent, but if we actually modulate the fields anywhere down from about a half a hertz up to roughly 15 hertz, what's the response in people? That's easy. It's brain jamming. We can cause nausea, blackouts, and disorientation as quickly as I can snap my fingers. Easy. Matter of fact, it becomes so intense it has about the emotional effect of waterboarding, except you never physically touch a person. It's really intense. Government loves this stuff. um, but it's really true. We discovered all that around 1969-ish or so, somewhere between 69 and 72, I think. I don't remember the dates that well. So I'm only trying to give you a dynamic idea of how real this really is in terms of the relationship between the neurology of the field. And, we could cause different sensations in the human neurological system by screwing around with different field propagations. I suspect that this whole thing about the Havana effect that they talked about in Cuba is field manipulation. I don't know that, but it follows that it could be field manipulation, not acoustic or something like that, because acoustic at that intensity is damn easy to monitor. Fields are much more difficult unless you really know what you're looking for. So the CEMI theory that you talk about, it's just not, to me, it's just not coherent enough. And I don't know that we'll ever get to that point because in order to sense a field when a person dies, in order to sense the field, assuming it's an electric field, it's not electromagnetic. It can't be electromagnetic because it doesn't have enough current to provoke the H field component of electromagnetics. It has to be the field in the E dimension, not the H dimension. And that's very obvious to me. So, and if it were standard, it wouldn't be a cocoon. It has to be a cocoon, and the only way you can maintain a cocoon is in various forms of quantum mechanics. Um, and that's an area that's just not sufficiently explored in terms of the human consciousness in order to understand it. So the semi idea is looking at the right direction, but you can make a point for and against in a completely arbitrary way with no data, because we don't have data. So how do I feel about it? And the answer is sure. It's looking like a good direction to go. Is it measurable? Not that we know of. Like, for example, if a person were to die and you and you could line up if you could line up volunteers to say, I want to run some experiments on you while you die. And then and oh, by the way, we have to have it consistent, so you're going to die many times. I think you'd have a hard time getting volunteers for that. But you could do something like there are detection devices called electrometers. Electrometers can measure, I don't know if they're sensitive enough in their current form to measure, but electrometers can measure a field in a purely quiescent sense. Like, for example, if you were picking up a static charge, walking down a triboelectric based static charge, walking down hallways in Las Vegas, where you reach up to put a key in a lock or something and you get a shock, which, by the way, is quite intense. It can be as much as 100 amps off the key. It happens very quickly too, about 200 picoseconds. It's really fast. I know this because I'm the author of the studies that prove that. Change the state of the art, by the way. Anyway, you can set up an electrometer and you can measure the field in terms of kilovolts or hundreds of volts or whatever the field intensity might be. The consciousness wouldn't have that much field intensity. It would be much lower than that. I don't know that electrometers, they don't measure consciousness, they just measure the presence of field. But from a theoretical point of view, if you had an electrometer in and around somebody's brain as they died, and if it were sensitive enough, you can measure the field migrating out. You wouldn't measure consciousness, you wouldn't measure the dynamic, but you could measure the presence or the non-presence of field. And the problem I have with people who deny near-death experience or deny CEMI, that doesn't explain the experiences that I had, which to me are as real as me sitting here breathing today. I don't see a distinction between my brain being in death. And all the neurological studies, all are very, very great at talking or discovering the dynamics, neurological dynamics within the brain. All of those fail when you die because the neurology is dead. It's zero. So something has to happen to get what religions call the soul out of the body. So from that standpoint, it's simple. But any particular piece of the CEMI theory can be picked apart easily enough, just because we don't have data. It's all hypothesis.
Okay. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. But can you tell our listeners and our viewers where they can find you, and where they can find
Oh,
your
my
book?
book is easy enough to find on Amazon. Just look for W. Michael King on Amazon, or the title of the book, Atheists Can Get to Heaven. The book itself has a website. Atheistscangettoheaven.com. And atheists can get it. It's all spelled out, just all run together. Anybody can contact me through my personal website, where you can find my complete CV and so on. Even a client list of about 2,000 companies, or 1,000 companies, including quite a number of government agencies that they're all in the systems and weapons business. But that's wmichaelking.com, and my contact information is in that website.
Are you still taking
Yes,
clients?
yeah, I am. I have a couple of proposals out right now for things like flying cars and which are curious little beasts, but not from a technology point of view. It's all the aerodynamics. It's not the electronics. But the problem is, if you're going to have something that a pilot is using to control the system, and you're using many kilowatts of power to make the thing fly and turn propellers, well, there's an inherent systems integration problem between all that power and low-level control logic signals. So that's a kind of place that I'd love to live in. When we were developing the first laser weapons, which was also around 1969, one of the biggest problems we had was control. Getting the amount of megajoules is a simple math problem into a high energy laser. Controlling it with enough azimuth and elevation, for example, now we have continuous lasers, by the way, that can get up to hundreds of kilowatts and megawatts. But at that time, the military mentality was, well, we can shoot a cannon or fire a rocket and knock a satellite out of space, so to speak, or an incoming ICBM, you boom, pop it. Well, the mentality back in the late 60s, well, if you take a laser and have enough megajoules in it, or gigajoules, I'm sorry, if you have enough, a joule, by the way, is a watt second. Anyway, if you, so a gigajoule is 1,000 million watt seconds, 1 gigajoule. In order to make this really work, you need about 5 gigajoules. So it's a whole lot of intensity in a very brief period of time. But the problem is, if you have an ICBM coming at you and you boom like that, how accurate can your azimuth and elevation be? Because if you're a minute of arc, you'll miss your target by miles. So,
Wow. That's not something that I think the everyday person's thinking about a lot. That's really interesting.
yeah, I do have that
But
problem communicating with people.
well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today, Dr. King. It means a lot to us. And
I compliment you on
yeah,
what you're trying to do. You're trying to bring, through your podcast, you're trying to bring a greater awareness of things, um, physics to neurology, to your audience. And my experience is somewhere in the boundary between what happens in neurology to what happens in fields to what happens in propagation of consciousness as fields beyond the body. And that's just a simple, well, not so simple from a physics point of view, but it's a logical progression.
yeah, and I think it's going to be more and more relevant, it seems, over the next few decades to have these kind of
I think,
conversations. So
I think, yeah, I
I'm glad
think,
that we're
personally speaking, if I were to, we don't need volcano gods anymore, do we? We don't need a volcano god to explain how that works. We don't need a rain god anymore. I actually believe that somewhere in the next century or so, what we're talking about now will become, I don't know that it'll become common knowledge, but humankind has always had to explain something it doesn't know to some mystical force. This is not, to me, at all a mystical force, period. It's just something that we don't know how to explain.